Hello everybody, it's The Worm, and I'm back for some more Raging Loop. Last time we began our journey through the extra stories. And before moving on to the next one, just a couple thoughts on the last one. It was pretty funny. But in terms of overall thoughts, I gotta say, it felt a lot like they were sort of opening up the world a bit more. And by the world, I mean the if Raging Loop was just this, it's within this world they've created, but it's a very localized area within that world. This story they just told with the bears showed some of the wider world there. In particular, it touched upon these entities that Haruaki was thinking about, similar to the god or badger or Shinai-sama or the wolves that existed in Yasumizu, and how they exist as a kind of mimetic thing. So not the memes, not the joke, haha, funny memes, the scientific idea of memes. And that's pretty interesting. And a lot of it really made me curious about their other works. I'm pretty sure they have at least one other visual novel. And I think I've heard, or someone may have mentioned, that it's within the same world as this one is. So that makes me wonder, we got a lot more with Chiemi here, and the idea that she's able to sort of detect these entities and interface with them in some way. And then previously we had the stuff with Mako and this thing called the Pasture, and then we have the Dream, what was it, Dreamwalkers or Dreamweavers, something like that. It feels definitely like there's a whole bunch of stuff just out there ready to be utilized in some fashion. But yeah, so that I'm just so very curious about whether their other visual novel, how it relates to all this, because they've raised a lot of interesting ideas here. Okay, let's move on to the next extra story. This one, it's comedy horror, and if you look at the description here, the high-strung doctor worries. To him, the end is in fact the beginning of everything. What is he to do with the rampaging woman destroying his image of her? So clearly this is going to be about Kyo, our boy Kyo, and his attempts at, I guess, building a life for himself and Rikako. And boy, good luck to him, because I don't think it'll be very easy, but let's find out, shall we?
雨は上がったか。よかった。今日はゴミを出さねばならん。それに洗濯物も。買い出しもあったな。確かいくつか特売があったはず。忙しくなる前に済ませねばならんな。やれやれ。つくづく晴れてよかった。
Kinosuke Nasato was aware that he was blessed. Though Fujiyoshi wasn't the best place to be born in, his family was rich and upheld good values. Unlike his wise, talented brother, he was a normal person, but he was given all he needed and then some. He'd also survived the horrible disease he'd gotten. Upon growing up, he began to feel like something wasn't right and left the village. Thankfully, there was no one there to stop him. Outside, he was no longer one of the special village heads, but even so, he continued to be blessed. There were no major accidents or failures, and he knew decent people. With the degree of education he had, he'd become able to become a doctor. He'd become able to be a doctor, excuse me. That was when he'd realized that there was nothing in particular that he wanted to do, but even so, he was blessed. It was a simple happiness, comprised of nothing but the fact that he couldn't complain, and didn't ask for most of the things he could easily gain. Enjoying his relaxed lifestyle, fully aware of that, many months and years passed by. Then in March, his family called him. They told him to stop wasting time playing around and come work at the village clinic. That was the first moment of actual discomfort he'd experienced. Naturally, he'd expected to be told something like this. He didn't want to return to the village, for he understood that he couldn't act the way he'd wanted to back there. In that village, village heads were supposed to command authority. It was right for them to be superior to the common folk and look down on Yasumizu. Thus, he'd acted exactly in that manner and was mocked because of it, earning the unwelcome moniker, the Nasato Blockhead. Looking foolish wasn't a matter of being right. The problem was that he couldn't display talent worthy of his position. That was why he didn't want to be dragged into this at all. This was the reason why he'd left after all. The truth was that there were ulterior motives behind it. The ones who'd ordered it were the Miguruma. They'd broken their non-interventionist policy and ordered the Nasato to summon their second son, and the family couldn't say no to that. However, Kinosuke wondered if even the Miguruma actually knew why they had to invite him. After all, not even he could really believe that he'd been saved from a supernatural conspiracy which had nearly killed him.
まあ、そんなことでもなければ信じられないことだらけではあるがね。
For example, the fact that the Snake's family abandoned their absolute power over the village, lost many of their people to a strange disease, and scattered completely. For example, the fact that the Monkey's family abandoned their control over Fujiyoshi's livelihood and suddenly escaped at about the same time the Miguruma fell. For example, the fact that the dissolution of the two most powerful families meant that his family, the Crow, would control the village now. And the final example, the fact that the descendant of the Spider, who'd controlled everything from the shadows, was in his old house. It was no time to grow complacent. The situation had been completely unlike what he had imagined. It wasn't a happy ending, at least for her. He wasn't warped enough to enjoy being with an unhappy girl, and he shouldn't be. Rokako Uematsu was lying in her bed on her stomach. Her limbs were completely spread out. The sleeping clothes she wore were as erotic as underwear. The actual clothes he'd bashfully bought her had been completely torn apart and left in the corner of the room. He'd then asked for Chiemi Serizawa's help, but she'd only bought lewd clothes. She thought it was a bit of bullying, but upon seeing them, Rokako turned bright red, shifted uncomfortably, and agreed to wear them, for some reason. She might have realized that wearing them made it hard for Kinosuke to look at her. By the way, she was awake right now. Her posture was actually more normal when she slept.
はしたないですよ、リカコさん。
うるさい。うんこ。
My goodness. They have never bleeped out anything, and now they do. What horrifying words did she utter?
おやめなさい、そういうのは。
Instead of replying, Rokako tried to roll and face upwards, but instead, she just fell out of bed. A crash.
痛くないですか？
痛い。
見ましょうか。
黙らっしゃい。ボケナス、ミミクソ、ゴミムシ、水ダコ、花モグル、銅金ブイブイ、三つ指怠け者。
やってましたね、昨日。 教育チャンネルで。
Ever since they'd moved here, Rikako hadn't left at all, and just spent the entire day in her room. All she did was eat, sleep, and watch TV, and that was the true good-for-nothing behavior. She particularly liked animal and learning shows for children. For whatever reason, she even watched the reruns at noon. Kinosuke brought her food from the nearby dining hall, and she ate it without even using chopsticks. He tried making sandwiches for her, but she didn't touch them at all. Rikako Uematsu was impossibly sulky.
いい天気ですよ。たまには外を歩きませんか。いつもの着物もクリーニングしてあります。芹沢のアホが買ってきたメイド服とかは着ないでいいですから。
Ah. Well. Okay then.
そのポーズは何なんですか。
侮辱的な挑発。
おやめなさい。その状態で手足をうごうごと動かすのは。
素早く。
おやめなさい。虫っぽいから。
Her current behavior was completely unlike the refined, beautiful Rikako Uematsu he knew. In fact, this creature didn't even resemble a woman.
そのやはり彼と久石君と会いたいのですか。
は、見当違いも甚だしい。私はただ敗者としての本分を全うしようとしているだけです。
敗者としての本分。
This was the first proper conversation in a while, but he found it more confusing than gratifying.
野里様にはわからない。私とあの方の100万の夢をとした甘美なるしのぎ合いの数々など、それがあんな形で決着するなど不本意の極みですが、まあ負けは負け。故に私は敗者にふさわしい無様な姿をこうしてあなたにさらしているのです。無様、ああ無様。
Kinosuke almost laughed as she, still expressionless, resumed her flailing limbs again. Instead, he held it in and asked,
それはあれですか。久石君が本名ではなかったという理屈の。
はあ、それはあの方の名手です。あれでこそあの方、名前当てなど宴の余興にいかにも手頃でしょう。私が植松の妙義の数々を披露して彼の口を割らせるのはなんと愉快でしたでしょうね。なのにあの一瞬の闇の中で牙を剥いたあのよくわからないけだもの、あいつのせいで夢の土蜘蛛様が、
Rikako moved around in an unnerving manner and started crying again. Her beautiful face was warped, and she crawled around like a child throwing a tantrum. Kinosuke sighed. His position in this incident, that he knew next to nothing about, was actually a bit special. The looping phenomenon created by none other than Rikako Uematsu, just about everyone involved couldn't remember anything about it. Or more like, the things that had happened were just undone. It only made sense. On the other hand, there were Haruaki Fusaishi, Chemi Sarazawa, both who kept their memories into the next loop after dying, and the mysterious woman Mitsuji Misamine. Besides that, there was Haru Makishima, who could read Haruaki's mind. She'd clearly remembered Rikako Uematsu's plot. Because of Haraki's planning, the only effect on the real world was Great Lord Shinai's death. Thus, the people of Yasumizu hadn't been told anything else, not even about Fusaishi. However, Kinosuke Nosato was an exception. He had Fusaishi and Sarazawa tell him everything and knew the outline of the incident. Besides Chikamochi Kamoshida, who somewhat understood what happened, Kinosuke was the only one who knew of the incident but didn't experience it himself. How did he get into this position? It was because Fusaishi trusted him, for some reason, but more than that, it was for Rokako Uematsu. Kinosuke and Rokako were actually the only ones who didn't participate in the Atami trip. Rokako Uematsu had been bound by Mitsuji Misamine and her people, then was examined in some way. Kinosuke was considered her guardian during that. Though they were just locked in some strange facility, they had to wait a few days. He was glad to not have gone with the people of Yasumizu, as he wasn't on good terms with them. He was worried about Rokako, though, and during their confinement, Misamine's people were strangely nice and constantly said that they wouldn't do anything bad to them. It made him feel powerless, but he was used to that. He trusted their words and expected Rokako to be freed quickly. Hang on a second. Kinosuke and Rokako were the only ones who didn't participate in the Atami trip? What's the Atami trip? Maybe this is in a different extra story? I don't recall this ever being mentioned before. Huh. I know one of the extra stories has to do with Mitsuji. It was one of the ones near the bottom, I think. Locked in a strange facility, huh? Okay. He trusted their words and expected Rokako to be freed quickly. That was exactly what happened after a week. However, that was only the beginning of the trouble. Rokako Uematsu had no ID. If the Miguruma still had been in power, they'd probably have taken it upon themselves to cover up her existence. For better or worse, the Miguruma had been destroyed during the week in the facility. As for what Rokako herself thought of this, needless to say, it wasn't much help. They had no choice but to spend 3 days in a hotel, with her in a different room, of course. One day, Chiemi came to visit. She'd been the one who told Kinosuke of the incident while he was running to Rokako.
私がこんな気を回すのは筋違いだと思うけど、野里さんも困ってると思うから手伝いに来ました。リカ子さん、もう安全ってなったみたいですけど、これからどうするんです？
As it turned out, Misamine had told her the situation, so she understood most of it. Kinosuke went and asked her to tell him about the incident again. It was just that absurd of a story. Then she asked him about what he'd do with Rokako. He'd reply that he'd take care of her until she recovered from her state of lethargy.
野里さん、紳士だったんですね。すみません。なんかいろいろ失礼なことを思ってて。
That apology itself was rather insulting, but Kinosuke didn't find it enraging. Chiemi then asked to meet up with Rokako. Kinosuke wasn't sure about it, but Rokako insisted to have a one-on-one with her, so he ended up staying outside as they faced each other.
お久しぶりです、芹沢様。愚かな負け犬を笑いにお越しですか？
やーいやーい、負け犬、フラレグモ、いじけ知女。
I mean, you were kinda asking for it there, Rokako.
いつかはよくも言いたい放題言ってくれましたね。誰が小便娘で売れ残りか。
Oof.
あなただってむっつりとかなんとか好き放題言ったでしょうに。
喧嘩売ってきたのはそっちでしょ。てかくっさ、リカ子さん臭い。どんだけお風呂入ってないんですか？
うるさい。私の勝手でしょ。くらえ悪臭攻撃。パッサパッサ。
うぎゃー、なんじゃこいつ。 なんか一周して面白くなってきたけど、さすがに女として終わりすぎだって。しょうがない。いろいろあったけど、なんだかんだ他人だとは思えないから手助けしますよ。
いらない。帰って。
あれ？負け犬に選択権があると思って？
After the exchange, which could easily be heard from behind the door, Sarazawa spent the whole day buying lots of stuff for Rokako, most of which Kinosuke couldn't comprehend. Sarazawa said her goodbye after demanding Kinosuke pay an absurd sum for the items.
まあ、何か困ったことがあったらいつでも懲らしめに来るんで言ってください。
He was at a complete loss of words, but since Rokako had become a bit more cooperative, he couldn't really complain about this, though she did seem a lot more sulky. That day, the man calling himself Fusaishi sent Kinosuke an email, even though he didn't recall ever giving him his address, which contained some additional information. I'm mailing to tell you some things I couldn't tell you when playing God. The courteous email contained the incident from his perspective. There were mentions of the records left behind in the Nasato's Yasumizu mansion, the Eye of the Miguruma, the surveillance control system. He had no reason to doubt anything anymore. They continued to exchange a few mails, but none of them mentioned Rokako. That was when he was called back to Fujiyoshi. With his brother as the current head of the family and mayor of the village, they were so busy that they summoned the supposedly subpar Kinosuke. After asking the concierge to look out for Rokako, he returned to Kama Fujiyoshi and met with his brother. He learned a few things. The Nasato were aware that something had been happening behind the scenes and that it led to the Miguruma collapsing. Some of the people, especially his brother, actually felt the change happening in the village. There was a psychological or perhaps religious change. As a central figure in the Tsunai faith, he could feel it. He could feel this even if he didn't want to. But even so, he had no way to know that it was all Uematsu's fault and that she needed to be taken away from the village. Kinosuke explained it to him with as much detail as he could. Though her ambitions had been crushed and she was harmless now, returning her to Yasumizu was difficult. However, she had special powers, so it was best to avoid trying to harm her or rousing her grudge. Basically, she needed to be kept away from the village, and that he would take it upon himself to do it. Excuse me. His brother instantly said that it was only because he had feelings for her. However, with all the information Sarazawa and Fusaishi had given him, Kinosuke had no reason to falter. On the same day, he brought his brother to Yasumizu's Nasato mansion and unsealed a certain piece of evidence. Using that as proof, he explained to him that during the last mist, there was supposed to be a fearsome massacre event, and that some outsider who somehow knew about it stopped it. It was quite hard to believe, but Kinosuke explained it with more intellect, sincerity, and passion than ever. When it came to Rokako Uematsu, Kinosuke told his brother that her exploitation at the hands of her family and the Miguruma had made her plot to destroy them. To Kinosuke, that didn't seem like a lie. Even if she had been working to fulfill the ultimate desire of her ancestors, it was those around her who'd pushed her over the edge. That was just how terrible her circumstances were, and his brother had to have known that even better than Kinosuke. In the end, he gained his brother's trust. Though most of it was due to the documents left by their forefathers, and physical proof such as the camera, and as head of an herbalist household, he knew of the unnerving paranormal healing methods employed by the Uematsu heads. He also knew that the Uematsu had even controlled the Miguruma once upon a time. Because of this, for the sake of Fujiyoshi, the head of the Nasato family had decided to appoint Kinosuke to shelter and hide Uematsu. However, there were conditions for that. She couldn't come near Fujiyoshi, and he had to watch over her at all times. Kinosuke also couldn't expect any help with matters regarding her. If you considered the state of the Nasato family and the threat of Uematsu, Kinosuke's brother was basically cutting them off entirely, but he'd agreed to that.
しかもちも家を追われた。しかしその先で自分の立ち位置を見つけようとしている。 巣立つべき時というものはあるんだろうな。少々遅すぎたとすら思うところだな。ああ、そうだ。この資料で先々先代の再評価をしても鹿持ちのやつを呼び戻そうなどと考えんことだ。その顔少しばかり考えていたろう。なぜダメかって。神罰が下るぞ兄貴。
Oh yeah. Yeah, Haru will not accept that.
それはともかく今後は休みずについても今まで通りにはいくまい。彼らの側の事情もいくらか聞いてはいる。そのあたりについてはまた別途相談をさせてもらいたい。そのくらいは時間を割いてくれても構わんだろう。
Kinosuke then left the Nasato mansion. The mist had cleared long ago, but there was someone waiting for him there, or here. It was Takumi Muro.
出てくのかまた。
笑わば笑いたまえ。これで私も長者でないも同然だ。
え、そんな大事なのかよ。
ああ、今後ここに戻ることも稀になるだろう。神様との約束くらいは果たさねばならんがね。
植松はどうなったんだ。
ああ、彼女は私が落ち着くまで西洋の世話をして差し上げることになった。
長者で流行ってる病気って聞いたが、一体何にかかったんだ。
君に言ってもわからんよ。
お前は最後までそれかよ。
そうとも、野里のボンクラは野里でなくなってもボンクラだったというわけだ。
さっきの取り消しだ。なんかお前変わったか。
さあ、変わったとすればこの村なのではないかね。それならば少なくとも君は変わる瞬間を見た一人のはずだが。
今でも夢だかなんだかわからねえよ。
ああ、私もそうだ。まあ夢だかなんだかわからないようなことで人生というのは移ろっていくものだということだ。達者でな、ムロ。
とうとう先輩をつけずじまいかよ。
今さら呼べるか、恥ずかしい。
安水も変わっていくさ。
ん？
大昔みたいにマロードの100人や200人笑ってもてなせるような場所になるかもしれねえ。
誰だ、そんな大それたことを考えているやつは。
さあ、ただなんとなくうちの神様が賑やかに従ってるみてえだからよ。いずれ若い連中がなんか始めんじゃないかって思ってるよ。
やれやれ、騒がしくなりそうだな。どうやら西洋のためには出て行って正解だったようだ。
落ち着いたらお前も来いよ。美人の嫁さんも連れてよ。
彼女とはそういうものではない。それに彼女こそもう藤吉村には戻れんだろうよ。
そんなに悪いのか。
いや、初版の事情だ。
んなもん気にすんな。ここは安水だ。来る者拒まずだぜ。村長様もおめこぼししてくれるって。
そうかもしれんな。
After that, he became extremely busy. He prepared a residence, prepared the move, and secured a workplace. However, it all went swimmingly. With the help of one of his teachers from college, he got a position in a countryside clinic, a decent distance away from Fujiyoshi. He'd also been able to buy a cheap place in the mountains not too far from where he worked. It was the perfect place to shelter Rokako and live in secrecy. He quickly signed the contracts and moved there. All that was left now was getting his things from the main Misato household transferred to him. Once that was over, he realized how well it went. He became aware of how blessed he was. There was only one problem left.
Gagi 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 ga.
It was Rokako Uematsu, who was menacing him with a strange sound. What was he to do here? He had no idea. She'd become a monster too much even for him to handle, and he loved her. The fact that she didn't go wild or try to run away implied she was okay with these conditions, but that was as far as it went. What if things stayed this way forever? He couldn't give up just like that. The key to this was persistence.
リカ子さん、はしたないですってば。
He tried talking to her.
あなたは一体何がしたいのですか?
She stopped menacing him, and he wasn't sure how to react to her question even after thinking about it for a few seconds.
何とは？
私をどうしたいのですか?
どうって。
なぶり者にでもすればいい。お望みのままになさいませ。何せ私は敗者なのです。ほら、そい。来るなら来い。
With a face as dull as a hammer, she rolled to the side and started spanking herself. It was the negative sort of sex appeal. She'd been like this ever since talking to Chiemi. It was an unproductive, hopeless relationship. Kinosuke had no idea how to handle it. He would start working as a doctor. The job would be hectic, and though he'd worked as an intern for quite a while, he'd spent too many years not doing anything, so he was quite worried. When he would be away, a portly housekeeper would look after Rokako, informing him if there were any problems. He hoped that time would fix her, but what if it didn't? Worrying to himself, he left Rokako's room. She continued spanking herself regardless, but grew bored of it and crawled back into her bed. She couldn't even sigh. Rokako felt like an empty shell now. She'd felt this way ever since that moment of darkness from the end of the incident. Something had taken the Tsuchigumo of dreams away from her. Or more like, it ate it. That was how it felt, at least. The Tsuchigumo of dreams was dead. At the very least, it couldn't fulfill her desire now. She could feel it in her veins. She had no idea what that monster did with the Tsuchigumo, nor did she care. The Tsuchigumo was her everything. The previous Uematsu head had raised her just for its sake. Thus, now that it was lost, she had no ambitions, desires, hobbies, or goals.
僕は望む植松里香子が土蜘蛛の復活を放棄しただの人として女性としてまっとうに幸せになることを。
That curse was binding her to this life, but her life was full of pain now. Someone who'd lost her heart couldn't find happiness again. Her happiness was supposed to come with the Tsuchigumo and Fusaichi. Now that she'd lost them both, she was like a loser with a consolation prize. Perhaps she could let herself break easily if Kinosuke Misato just had his way with her. However, that wasn't happening, and she was left to live as a bored animal, only fulfilling its physical desires. She grew more irritated. She was surprised she could still feel irritation. She'd felt a blazing flame of irritation when talking to Chiemi, but looking back on it, it was strange. Rokako Uematsu had thought that all of her emotions had come from the Tsuchigumo. She'd thought that both the aloof Rokako and the bewitching Uematsu personalities had just been given to her. Perhaps some emotions and desires remained inside her? What of it, though? Would it let her become happy again? No. Absurd. She didn't care. She rolled to the opposite side in irritation. That was when she saw a small spider. She could instantly tell that it wasn't a normal spider. It was very roundish in all aspects, resembling a spider straight from a manga. And it was pink. Could it be? Could it really?
夢の土蜘蛛様。
It couldn't be. Did her late master actually survive? Rokako looked into it and called out to it.
蜘蛛様、蜘蛛様。ああ、こんな姿になってしまわれて。でも、生きておられた。滅びてなどおられなかった。ああ、なんたる行幸でしょう。ならば、悲願を再びなしましょう。男を貪り、子をなし、新たな巣を見つけて、命脈をつなぎましょう。いつの日か、あなた様が再び蘇る日まで。雲様。
Something wasn't right. It was certainly different than what she knew it to be. But she thought it was simply because it was smaller. However, there was something inherently different about it. The spider actually avoided her when she tried to touch it. It backed away as though falling on its backside, or out of embarrassment. She caught up to it with her fingers and tried touching it. It was soft. It was more soft and warm than any other such critter. After a few pokes, the pinkish spider began to convulse in some strange way, and when she retracted her finger, it fell on its side. Did it die? She assumed that for a moment, but it was still moving its legs slowly, as though breathing. It was just sleeping. Rokako somehow understood that this was a fragment. The wicked, grand, and powerful Tsuchigumo was a being that represented a scary brand of motherhood that birthed and consumed all, and this was just something hiding within its shadow. It was paired with the Tsuchigumo of dreams, and it was small and weak from the start. And it was also the entity representing the extremely bashful, yet really love-craved personality that was Rokako.
私は
Might not have been as empty as I thought. It was just something that the dark creature had failed to consume. But it was a sign that Rokako was still there, still here. However, she didn't know how to interpret it. Still perplexed, she rolled over again.
どうしよう。
She hadn't even considered what it would be like to just live as Rokako. Was there anything she wanted to do as just herself? She was tired and annoyed. But she remembered how Rokako had once wanted to try loving someone. Without the TV on, her room was a very boring place. She hadn't bathed in a while. That reminded her of Chimi's grin, and with great irritation, she went to use the shower. Upon realizing a certain problem, she looked around the bathroom for something, but couldn't find it. Kinosuke had probably removed it out of caution.
バカバカしい。自殺などもうしないというのに。
She didn't feel like dying. She knew better than anyone that it was painful, and this wasn't a dream. Following that darkness, she no longer had any control over dreams. Did the pink spider have any powers? It didn't seem that way, so she was still just a woman. And as a woman, what did she think of this situation? This house was constructed with two families in mind, so both floors had a bath and a toilet. This was intentional on Kinosuke's part, who had considerately given her space. Who was considerately giving her space. Thus, ever since moving here, she had never gone downstairs. That was why Kinosuke was at a loss for words when she came down all wet and wearing nothing but a bathrobe.
Rikako-san?
カミソリをください。野里様。
何？そんな何をするおつもりですか？よもやまた自分を傷つけるなどと。
無駄毛を処理します。ご覧ください。我がぼうぼうたる脇を。 ちなみに私はいつも明日も。
うわー、なんてことをおっしゃるのか。
何ですか、騒がしい。お医者様ならば堤防など慣れっこでしょう
に。わかりました。安全そうなものを買いに行かせます。
行かせる。
ええ、まあ私にはそういうのはちょっとわからないから紹介したでしょ。明日は彼女に買いに行かせますから。
野里様が買いに行くのです。
は？
ついでに植松家では月の者が来るときは特別な小屋で物意味をしていましたが、こちらではどうしますか。
それはそれなりの用具がドラッグストア等で市販されているかと。
テレビで宣伝しているあれですね。そろそろ入り用ですので、そちらもお買い与えください。
それこそ彼女に頼んで。
と言いますか、あの家政婦様にはお暇をお出しください。
どういうことです？気に食わない点でも。
しばらくは他人と接したくありません。それくらいなら自分で身の回りの世話くらい済ませます。面倒だけど。
しかし
安水ではずっとそうしてきた。
突然どうされたのですか。あんなに無気力だったのになぜ急に。
脇毛光線。
見ません、見えませんから。
単にテレビに飽きただけです。それにあなたに借りばかり作れば後でどんなひどい要求をされるか知れたものではありませんから。極力迷惑はかけぬよう手と頭を動かしたいと思います。
いい兆候ですな。なるほど。しかし私はもう少し様子を見るべきかと。
逃げたり死んだりもいたしません。何かのために苦しむ甲斐も今はありませんので。そんなわけで家政婦は不要です。私を家から出したくなければ野里様が買いに行ってください。
あなたはどうであれ私を悩ませるようですな。
嫌いになりましたか。では仕方ない。どこぞでまたレアのはしためを務めここをしのぎましょう。
行ってきますから待ってなさい。
After saying that with a flushed face, Kinosuke left the living room without even looking her into the eyes. Looking into her eyes. For some reason, her irritation had subsided. After getting into her under kimono, she rummaged through the kitchen and found a tea caddy. She didn't know how to use boiled water or fire in general, but she had used a microwave before, so she just warmed up some water and tea leaves in there. She then took the hot cup with her sleeves and sat down on the sofa and drank. It was too hot, too fragrant, and the leaves were bitter, but she still found it delicious. If their sensations weren't stimulated, people's minds and bodies would atrophy.
やはり違う。
Even if she wore the same clothes as before, she was clearly different now. Back then, there were no times when she didn't think of anything, Whenever she was alone, she would think of the Tsuchigumo. She would think of the ancestral grudge she'd inherited and pile yet more upon it. By doing so, she would make the Tsuchigumo stronger and more malicious. But now, she often thought of nothing. That didn't make her feel empty, however. In fact, the emptiness was fulfilling. She recalled that Buddhism was basically about that. Thinking about such things, she looked to the side. Most of the things Kinosuke had brought over had been unpacked, and there was already a large TV and bookshelves in the living room. After drinking some more tea, she walked up to the bookshelf. His family were readers, and it was full of large books. Most of them seemed to be about medicine. Avoiding dictionaries and technical books, she picked up a thin, smallish new text.
看護学の基礎理念。ナイチンゲールの看護覚書に学ぶ。
The title was complex, but the text inside was in a large, easily read font, aimed at newbies, apparently. She decided to read it a bit, as it would stimulate her brain more than the TV. Upon hiding it in her sleeve, she looked at the shelf again. She found a small pink spider sitting there. Upon noticing that Rokako was looking at her, the spider jumped onto one of the nearby cardboard crates. She followed it with her eyes, but quickly lost sight of it. She then walked up to the cardboard box and opened it. Uh-oh. Forbidden Wife 4, The Afternoon Grail. The Secret Class, The Music of Sweet Moans. The Lustful Hospital, A Prescription of Love and Immorality. It was full of books with black covers. She quickly opened them, closed them, then stuffed them into her sleeves. Then she quickly returned to her room and hid them under her pillow, all with a cool face. She sat down on the sofa and drank the cold tea.
おいしい。
She said that out of embarrassment, but it didn't hide anything. It was still before noon. She didn't want to read that so early. Instead, she chose to read the first book she found. She hadn't read since middle school, so she read really slowly, but it gradually came back to her, so it wasn't a pain for her. Even after a whole hour, she wasn't done with half the book, and Kinosuke wasn't back yet. He was either hesitant to buy what she wanted, or was irritated with her and was wasting time to cool off. Rokako seemed to be a worse person than she herself realized. She'd only made it through all the hardships in her life with a stoic expression, not because she was naturally calm, but because she had a clear goal. Would Kinosuke grow tired of her if she continued using him like that and pushing him around? Would she feel refreshed when that happened? There was nothing that she wanted to do to leave this place and put herself at risk in the process. To do enough. However, she couldn't find a reason to stay here. He had let her stay partially out of obligation to his family, but mostly because he liked her. She could give herself to him as thanks, but he probably wouldn't want it. Then, was she supposed to love him? That was actually difficult. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see him as more than a sympathetic clown. He was a foolish, sad older man who was too fixated on a woman who gave him a special experience only 20 years ago. It was completely impossible for her to love him as much as she had Haruaki Fusaishi. Then there was only one answer.
面倒くさいな。
But it would spare her the irritation. As she thought that, she heard a voice outside. She thought she misheard it, but no. It was a childish, high-pitched cry. Rokako walked up to the window and looked out through the curtains. A child? A small boy was sitting and crying between the hedges. She went to the garden, but even though it was still in the house's territory, she still had to gather her wit. The garden was large but poorly looked after. It was completely overgrown, almost like a forest. Had this house been unoccupied for that long? But didn't Kinosuke say the weather was good? The sky she could see through the spaces in the leaves was all cloudy. Anyway, the boy. He looked around 7 or 8 and was a lot bigger than Mako. His clothes looked really bad, his shirt was loose and threadbare. But if you ignored that, his face was well structured, making him look quite intelligent.
かわいい。
The fact that the thought felt a bit more dirty than it should made her curse her upbringing.
どうしたの？
The boy gasped. It made her realize that her appearance probably made her look like a ghost anywhere outside of Fujiyoshi.
私は植松里香子と申します。回るで上、末で松と読みます。
お姉ちゃん、誰？
Why would he ask that after she just introduced herself? It made her a bit upset, but then she realized that he wanted to know her situation.
このお家に住まわせてもらっているものです。
え？お化け屋敷に住んでるの？
お化け屋敷。
うん。3年の男子はみんなそうやって呼んでる。
It was the first time she'd gotten a proper look at the building, and the vines did look a bit ominous. Then there was the unkempt garden, there was grass as tall as her knee, and that again must have been unnerving.
お化けが出るの？
うん。たけしが見たって。
勝手に入ってはダメよ。ここは人が住むお家なんだから。
うん。ごめんなさい。もしかしたらたけしはお姉さんのことを見たのかも。
私を？
うん。綺麗な女の幽霊だって言ってたから。
Those words made her heart waver. Was he into older girls? Watch it. Watch it, Rokako.
次長。
え？
何でもありません。私はつい先日この家に来ました。だから多分人違いです。
そうなんだ。そしたらお姉さん、お化けと一緒に住んでるの？
She couldn't perceive such things. She might have been able to do something if the Tsuchigumo was still with her, and this was a dream, but there was no point in considering that. Those of the Iguruma blood would probably have the talent to see such things. She remembered that Kinosuke had said that it was really cheap. Perhaps it had a shady history.
気をつけないと。
And Uematsu had no reason to fear beings of a different world, but she did have to consider the risks involved. If one mingled with the unknown and the invisible, they had to treat it with proper respect. Kinosuke would have to be told about this and look into it.
どうしたの？怖い顔。
いいえ、何でもないの。それよりも、どうしてそのお化け屋敷に一人で来たの？
From her time watching TV, she knew that urbanites enjoyed tests of courage, where they braved the darkness in Yomi. However, it was something done with others, not alone. He awkwardly looked down as if he was holding something back. Rokako realized how kind she was being to him. What happened to her unpleasant personality?
お家にあげていいかはわからないから、せめてお茶でも持ってきましょう。
いいよ、そんなの。
She was disappointed.
聞いてくれる？
私でよければ聞き取り、いいえ、お聞きしましょう。
ありがとう。父さんと母さんが別れるんだ。
5個ずつくらいに。
違うよ。うちの親はロボじゃない。離婚だよ。離婚。
まあ。
According to TV, it wasn't uncommon these days. A divorce in Fujiyoshi would be the talk of the village.
俺、邪魔なんだよ。父さんも母さんも引き取りたくないって思ってる。
どうしてそう思うの？
かるよ。しんちゃんはどっちと一緒にいたいって聞かれるとき、どっちも困った風に笑うんだ。俺は成績も悪いし、悪さもいっぱいしたから嫌われてるんだ。
どうしてご両親は離婚するの？
父さんが仕事で家にいなくて、母さんはローンとか仕事とかいろんなことで疲れたって。
共働きだったのね。
うん。父さんは銀行員で、母さんは会社で働いてる。
Despite what the boy had said, the way he talked was very detailed, and he seemed to be quite mature for his age. You would never find children like this in a failing household. It was probably going well before. They had to be pretty rich, and the parents were probably more discerning before. But something had happened between them and tore them apart. There was probably no bad guy here, it was just an unfortunate turn of events. To Rokako, it seemed that urban society was a machine made of gears that created misery whenever it failed. And since she'd been involved with many marriages and births, she knew a lot about this, even though she had no first-hand experience.
お父様とお母様はあなたから見てもう仲直りはできないと思う？
うん。俺がいないところでは、二人ともほとんど口を聞かないし、ずっとお金のことで揉めてるから。
That seemed difficult.
あなたはどうしたいの？
選べないよ。
And no one could blame him for that.
それでここに来たのね。
うん。選べないって叫んで、ここへ来て。それで、お化けに殺されたら、もう父さんと母さんは、俺のことで悩まなくていいから。
He felt that trapped. Though, he was probably right in assuming they would get a divorce and that he had to choose. In fact, that might have been best for their relationship. There were many examples where parents continue to be parents even after divorce, and many examples where the ex-spouses managed to be on good terms again. However, she didn't want to console him with such optimistic thoughts. Life was oftentimes unreasonable and thoroughly filled with despair. It wasn't unlikely that this divorce could lead to the end of this child's future. Rokako didn't know what to say to him. Would he calm down if she hugged him and told him she was there for him? Who knew? But this Uematsu-like situation was a path she didn't want to take. As the boy resumed crying, Rokako looked around. Her eyes became fixated on a red thread coming off his shirt. For no real reason, she reached out and to pull it free. When she touched it...
どうしたの？
あなたのお母様は少し前に大きな手術をなさったかしら？
え？どうしてわかったの？
She then touched another thread she noticed.
お父様は命令でどこか遠くに行くことになっていた。
うん。それも当たりだよ。
His collar was covered in countless colored threads. Most of them were so thin they were almost invisible. They seemed to be transparent too, and only became more and more transparent as they went on before they vanished. Both those two stood out a lot. After all, they were cut.
そうか。
This was a first for her, but she instantly understood what it was. There was a pink spider on the boy's head. This was the power of the frail spider. The timid little creature made it possible for Rokako, who'd wished to connect to people, to see such connections as threads. And if they were here...
あのね、よく聞いて。
ん？
あなたはこれからお家に帰ってお父様とお母様の質問に答えなくてはなりません。だけどその時にお父様とお母様が嫌な笑顔にならないようにおまじないをして差し上げます。だからあなたはよく考えてあなたの後悔をしない選択をしてください。あなたがどちらといたいか、どちらがあなたを必要としているか、どちらが望む未来につながるか。今度は逃げずに決めるのです。わかりましたか？
She said such complicated words without hesitation or restraint. He seemed to sense her honesty, and nodded slowly, but surely.
良いでしょう。
She never expected to sing this song herself.
嬉しまら瞳へ来たり。
Rokako's fingers took one of the cut threads.
嬉しまらひとまとい線。
Her other hand searched through the empty space, creating a cut thread of the same red color.
くくれやひとひにひとに切りたった。
Threads could be bound. Rokako quickly connected the two threads with a knot.
もう一晩特別ご奉仕です。嬉しまら瞳へ来たり。嬉しまらひとまとい線。くくれやひとひにひとに切りたった。
That was a long-lost song. Back in that land, guests had once been treated and welcomed as gods, and this was an ancient marriage song used in a time when one-night trysts were common. It went on to be taken away, warped into something sinister, and come back as a saddening caller for those under Shinai. She could vaguely remember it as a memory of her Tsuchigumo. That was probably why the strand of divinity took on such a shape in her.
つながった。
She confirmed that she relinked the severed bond between the boy's father and mother. However, she wouldn't say that.
おまじないはおしまいです。辛いことがあっても強く生きて。この浮世は強いものに対しては下手に出るものですから。
うん。なんだか少しだけ元気になったよ。ありがとう、お姉ちゃん。俺、家に戻るね。
ええ、元気で。
The boy ran toward the gap in the hedge, then vanished. No, he fell. She ran up to there and found an unused well hidden behind the grass. Its sides were low enough for someone to fall in.
大丈夫？
She could hear sounds of water, screams, and ragged breaths from down below.
どうすれば。
リカ子さん、
That was when Kinosuke and Sato appeared nearby.
ここにおられたのですか。外に出られるのはいいが、しかしちょっと今日は無理をしすぎでは。
助けて。
え。
助けなさい。フルイドに子供が縄か何かを使って。早くして。このノロマ。
The change in situation was sudden, but Kinosuke quickly took care of it. He used the packing tape from when he moved in as a makeshift rope and quickly lowered himself in. Rokako pulled up when he gave the sign and helped Kinosuke save the boy. He successfully made it out, but the boy's body had already gone limp. It had taken a while to prepare the rope. He'd drowned during this time. Rokako felt herself become more irritated with Kinosuke. She almost began cursing him, but she restrained herself. She had to. Kinosuke had to try and focus on saving the boy's life.
聞こえるか、しっかりしろ。
While occasionally calling out, he performed CPR on the boy. He was a true doctor right now, and his whole being was invested in saving this dying boy.
しっかりしろ。どうして。
Why? Rokako had wondered that herself. Why did such an unreasonable tragedy have to happen? Why did she have to feel such sadness? Was it because there was no God here? Did God just not exist, and the people had to fend for themselves alone against this cold world?
どうしてだ。これではまるで。これがたった今心肺停止した患者とはとても思えないぞ。
Huh? Before Rokako could voice that,
お姉ちゃん。
she heard a voice behind her. There was a childlike presence there. He was all smiles, and right next to him there were the presences of two people. Though invisible, they were bits of warped space, or distortions in reality. She could also sense that the boy was accompanying them.
思い出したんだ。この家に住んでたのは俺だった。俺と父さんと母さんだった。あの日、俺は泣いて木の間から外に抜けようとして井戸に落ちて、それで父さんと母さんも悲しんで死んじゃったんだ。
それじゃ。
母さん美人だよ。もうだいぶ前だからこんな感じになっちゃったけど。たけしのやつひどいよね。元友達ん家に肝試しに入んなよな。でもありがとう。お姉ちゃんが糸をつないでくれたおかげで俺は父さんと母さんを引っ張って連れて行ける。じゃあね。
落ちなかれ。というのは、あなたたちには違うでしょうね。さようなら。
The boy smiled, and she smiled back. The next moment, the boy and the two distortions vanished. Sunlight leaked through the trees. The sky was so bright it was hard to believe. It wouldn't be strange to experience something like this in the mountain's darkness. But she didn't expect it here in this town. The world sure was a strange place.
そんなバカな。
Kinosuke's pitiful voice made Rokako turn around. He was completely shocked. The freshly drowned boy had become a white skeleton about as tall as him. The appearance of human bones had turned this into a matter for the police. They'd already known what happened here. The married couple committed suicide while their child had vanished without a trace. This house was quite a paranormal hotspot. The stranger thing about this was the fact that they had records of searching for the child in the well. The police were confused, then expressed their sympathies for the couple who had unknowingly moved into a ghost house. Rokako replied,
それは大丈夫です。もうきっと成仏なさっていることでしょう。あと私はこのボンクラとは夫婦ではありません。
Exhausted, Kinosuke lay down on the sofa in the living room. Way too many things had happened today. Rokako had left a room, instantly given him an impossible task, made him buy something embarrassing, then experience something paranormal, and then he'd have to deal with the police. All of that was coupled with Rokako's eccentricity and harsh words, and it was taking a toll on him. He considered whether he would really start living here. Was his plan for this life in this town too incomplete? Was he attempting something far beyond his limits? As he thought to himself.
何を難しい顔をしておいでですか?
He heard the voice from right beside him.
リカコさん、いつの間にそこに。
何ですか? 私は幽霊ではありませんが、あなたがうんうんと考え込んで気づかなかっただけです。
なるほど。しかしどうしてここに
2階に閉じこもれとおっしゃるならそのようにいたしますが。
Her tone was as harsh as always, but for some reason she felt strangely close.
そんなことは言いませんが、どういう風の吹き回しかと思っただけで。
勝手にすみません。先ほどその本棚から本を借りました。看護に関する本です。差し支えなければ引き続き読ませていただけませんか？
いえ、構いませんよ。事前に伺いたかったところですが、今後ここの棚からはご自由にどうぞ。
すみません。ありがとうございます。この椅子は座り心地がいいから今後読書に使ってもよろしいですか？
それはもちろん。
何をしょんぼりとされているのですか？その貧相な表情を見ているとイライラするのです。
She was in a bad mood again. Kinosuke sighed.
さっきは一瞬かっこいいと思わなくもなかったのに、あなた様と来たら情けのない。何でもありません。とにかくどうなされたのです？
Was she only acting mad to hide that she was worried?
最近はどうも超常現象づいていて、調子が狂うなと思っていただけですよ。
私もそれに含まれますか？
あなたについては目に見える部分ではそんなに派手なことが起きていないからさほどは。しかし夫妻君は神の振りについてはともかく巻き戻りについては信じるしかないですし。
まったくとんでもない話でした。
あなたのせいだったんでしょ？
それはともかく
She played it off.
あの親子についてはあまり共感をなさらないがよいです。休みずを読みとみなすのは不当な見下しですが、読み人と目を合わすなという長者の教えには一理あるのです。でなければ引きずられます。
ああ、私の恩師も医者はあまり霊安室には行くもんじゃないとか言っていたな。
そういえばあなた様は死体が怖かったのでは？
さっきはそうでもなかったですね。結局は 単なる場数不足と度胸不足だったのかもしれません。あの両親はなんであんな見た目になっていたんでしょうね。少年は人間と見分けがほとんどつかなかったのに。
自殺や心中をした方は成仏できないと聞いたことがあります。よくあの子、ご両親を黄泉へと無事に連れて行ってくれることを願うばかりです。
そちらでうまくやってくれると良いですね。
Rokako looked down and fell silent. Kinosuke couldn't really understand what she was expressing.
ところで、ここが良くない家だということは知らされないのが妙です。お家屋さんに掛け合って苦情をお伝えになってはいかがですか。お家賃がもっと安くなるかも。
おお、なるほど。
家政婦様にはお暇は出されましたか。
ええ、移動中に電話でキャンセルの連絡をしましたよ。
わかりました。料理の本はお持ちですか。
Confused by the constant changes in subject, Kinosuke spoke.
病院食やらの本はあったはずですが、一体どうしたんです。
居候のみ宿代になるとも思えませんが、料理くらいはできるようになりたいと思います。
え、
掃除洗濯はこれでも得意です。あとは勉強でもして何か資格でも取ろうと思います。それであなた様のご恩には報いたいと思っております。そういうことで私をここに置いていただけますか、野里清之助様。
そりゃ私としては願ってもない。いや、本当にいいんですか。
勘違いはしないでください。
Rokako brought her face, long eyelashes, and red eyes closer to him, and Kinosuke almost stopped breathing.
どうやら私は清之助様限定でひどく底意地の悪い人間になるようで、あなた様が大層嫌いなのかもしれません。しかしあなた様は少しは尊敬に足るお方と見受けましたので、ご迷惑をかけぬよう私も努力をする次第。決して心を許したわけではございませんゆえ、ご承知くださいませ。
Rokako spoke a lot, and unusually quickly, too. At a loss for breath, she panted a bit, then looked away from him. After seeing that gesture, Kinosuke, who had feelings for her, instantly forgot his troubles with her, and just smiled.
わかっていますよ、リカコさん。これからよろしくお願いします。
せいぜいご注意なさいませ。あなた様への嫌がらせで食事に虫でも入れるかもしれません。
楽しみですよ、リカコさんの手料理。
Kinosuke was blessed. Aware of that again, he looked up at the ceiling. He thought he might have seen a pink bug out of the corner of his eye, but it had to be his imagination. And
ところでリカコさん、本を持って行ったのは本当にあの棚からだけですよね。
もちろんです。何を疑うのですか。
haha. Oh, okay. Well, Rokako and Kyo. You know, I think they're gonna be okay. I think things are gonna work out. Well, that was quite something. 3 more to go. I will once again, I'm gonna let that story sit for a hot minute before diving into the next story, and I'll be able to I'll put some thoughts together for it. I hope you've all enjoyed that, and I hope to see you next time for more extra stories of Raging Loop. Bye bye.